This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, the editor-in-chief at FanDuel and at numberfire.com, and this is episode 435 of the Late Round Podcast, one of the many shows that are part of the FanDuel Podcast Network. Pause. Thanks for tuning in. So I haven't brought this up on the Late Round Podcast for some reason, or I don't think that I have, but every week so far of the NFL season, I've been doing a live snake draft with my colleagues Jim Sonis and Brandon Gudula on FanDuel Live. They happen on Fridays at 3:30 Eastern. We go through a three-way weekly snake draft, talk about slate strategy, and help you get ready for the games upcoming that week. For those that tune in live this week, we'll be giving away a free ticket to the FanDuel Sunday Million right after the draft ends. For more info, subscribe to FanDuel's YouTube page or follow FanDuel across social media to make sure that you don't miss it. Now with that, let's get to this week's transactions. Buy Travis Fulgham and add Jalen Reagor. Travis Fulgham has been awesome since his breakout game against Pittsburgh a few weeks ago. Over his last three games, his target shares have been 36.1%, 26.3%, and 26.8%. He scored 31.2, 19.5, and 12.3 PPR points. No Eagles player, according to Pro Football Focus, has run more routes than Fulgham from weeks 5 through 7. But because of his name, because he's this out-of-nowhere breakout player, fantasy managers will likely think that this Fulgham breakout is kind of fluky. But I don't think that. He's done this against pretty solid opponents. And over this time frame, these 3 weeks, according to PFF, he's top 10 in yards per route run. And like I've talked about on this show before, he has an underrated prospect profile too. But maybe the top reason to bring him up this week, and I'm bringing up Jalen Reagor too because he's back and practicing. And I love me some Jalen Reagor. But the reason I'm bringing these guys up is Philadelphia's rest of season schedule. Through the end of the fantasy football season, the Eagles get the Cowboys, Giants, Browns, Seahawks, Packers, Saints, and Cardinals, and then the Cowboys again. None of those matchups should scare anyone. 6 of those 8 matchups are coming against teams that rank in the top half of the league in adjusted fantasy points allowed to wide receivers, meaning they're easy opponents. So now is the time to invest in the Eagles' passing attack, at least the pass catchers. I really like Fulgham and Reagor moving forward. Add Rashard Higgins. So Odell Beckham tore his ACL. Next man up, Rashard Higgins. In Sunday's win over the Bengals, Higgins caught all 6 of his targets for 110 yards. He had a 21.4% target share. If that type of share continues, and I think that it can, but if that continues, he's going to be in the wide receiver 3 discussion. Maybe even better, because upcoming for Cleveland are games against the Raiders, Texans, Eagles, Jags, and Titans. Each one of those opponents ranks 14th or better as matchups against wide receivers, according to my schedule-adjusted fantasy points allowed method. And for the record, in deeper leagues, you can add Donovan Peoples-Jones. He should now get more run as Cleveland's wide receiver 3. Buy Keenan Allen. Sometimes you have to buy high in fantasy football. I talk about this all the time. But with Keenan Allen, I don't know if we're buying high right now. I think that he can get better. He's one of 2 wide receivers, with DeAndre Hopkins being the other one, with at least a 30% target share this year. And that includes a game that he left early. He's outside the top 10 in PPR points per game at wide receiver, but from here on out, I think he's going to be a top 10 guy. It's not that bold, but I just at least want to say it. The biggest knock on Allen so far this year has been touchdowns. He only has 2 of them despite having 481 receiving yards. That's 240.5 yards per touchdown. The league average at wide receiver this year is a touchdown on every 163 yards. Now, Allen hasn't had amazing usage close to the end zone. He's tied for 30th in red zone targets this year. But he's still underperforming in the touchdown column. And then similar to guys like Rashard Higgins and the Eagles wide receivers, another reason to buy Keenan Allen is the schedule. Through the rest of the season, the only tough matchup that LA has on paper is against New England. And as of today, no team has a better fantasy football playoff schedule for their passing attack than the Chargers do. In weeks 14 through 16, the Chargers face the Falcons, Raiders, and Broncos. So I really like Keenan Allen down the stretch here. Sell Mike Evans. I've talked about Mike Evans more than any other player this year on this podcast. I understand. It might seem like overkill to call him out as a sell again. But fantasy managers don't know what to do with Evans right now. He's had back-to-back bad outings, and they don't know what to do. So the question that I posed in the 15 transactions column this week is there any hope? Is there any hope for Mike Evans? And I don't think that there is. Evans has now played 3 games without Chris Godwin. He's played 4 games with him. Without Godwin, he's averaged 21.2 PPR points per game. He's had a target share per game of 22.8%. With Godwin, he's averaged 7.3 PPR points per game. He's had an 8.8% target share per game. He's been absolutely horrible with Chris Godwin this year. Now, we could say that maybe this is just a small sample, maybe this doesn't really matter, but guess what? Tampa Bay added Antonio Brown. There's another mouth to feed in that offense. If it was some random replaceable wide receiver, I wouldn't really care. The mouth to feed argument doesn't really matter for something like that. But this is Antonio Brown, you guys. I know he hasn't played football in a year, but the last time we saw Antonio Brown, he was still really good. It's not like Antonio Brown had this Dez Bryant trajectory. It's not like Brown saw this massive decline in his production, and that's why he left football. He left football because of some off-the-field stuff. On the field, it's a different story. That's just how it is. And maybe Antonio Brown doesn't do anything. Maybe it's a horrible signing. But there's still not a whole lot to latch onto with Mike Evans because of these splits that we've seen with Chris Godwin. And the thing is, with Evans at least, you have a name that you can sell. Everyone who plays fantasy football knows who Mike Evans is. So even if he's not producing very well, you can still probably sell him for something. I actually made a poll on Twitter on Monday, and I said, who would you rather have rest of season in PPR leagues? Mike Evans or Travis Fulgham? And about 2/3 of people said Travis Fulgham. I would be in that bucket. I would rather have Fulgham than Mike Evans. But considering that 1/3 of people are saying Mike Evans, that means you can still sell him right now. Add JaMychal Hasty. So the San Francisco backfield is really, really banged up. Raheem Mostert's on IR. Tevin Coleman hasn't played since week 2. And then in week 7, Jeff Wilson, who was randomly the lead back, he hurt his ankle. And that allowed rookie JaMychal Hasty to build off of his 9-carry game from week 6. He carried the ball 9 more times against the Patriots in week 7 for 57 yards. And so far this year, Hasty's been pretty good on his touches. According to NumberFire's success rate statistic, which is the percentage of positive expected points runs made by a running back, Hasty has been right in line with Raheem Mostert and Jeff Wilson. So if each of the backs that are ahead of him on the depth chart miss week 8, he's in play. Hold Chase Claypool. Look, the Steelers wide receiver group to a lot of people this year, and to me included, they've been pretty tilting. Deontay Johnson in particular, because he seems to play all the time and then he gets hurt. And I talked a lot about this Steeler wide receiver group on this show this season. I talked about them last week, and I mentioned that Deontay Johnson was a good buy. And the reason for that is because people were down on Johnson as a result of Chase Claypool's emergence. This is what I wrote in my 15 transactions column last week. It says, quote, Claypool hurts James Washington more than anyone else on the Steelers, as long as everyone's healthy. In weeks 1 and 2, the 2 games where Johnson's been healthy, the snap split between Johnson and Washington was 109-68 in Johnson's favor. The reason we've seen a spike in Washington's production, especially this past week, was because Johnson's been sidelined. And then fast forward 1 week. And look, I'm not saying this just to pat myself on the back here. I do know the Steelers well, don't get me wrong, but I'm mentioning all this to give you guys some context about how this Steelers offense operates and what they're doing with their wide receivers. The snap counts among Steelers wideouts in week 7 against Tennessee: Juju Smith-Schuster at 65, Deontay Johnson at 59 snaps, Chase Claypool 51, James Washington 18. And then meanwhile, according to PFF, Smith-Schuster had 47 routes run, Johnson 43, Claypool 33, and James Washington 12. Basically, what this all tells us is Claypool operated as the team's number 3 wide receiver. To me, though, from my perspective, that was to be expected. I'm actually looking at what happened in week 7 as a good thing, because he clearly ran ahead of James Washington. That wasn't happening earlier this season when Deontay Johnson was healthy. In weeks 1 and 2, James Washington was getting more run than Chase Claypool. So that alone tells us that better days are ahead for Chase Claypool. Don't freak out. Maybe your expectations were just way too high for Claypool entering that game. And yeah, I thought he was going to have a better performance than he had against Tennessee too. This is why we look at peripheral numbers though. The peripheral numbers aren't horrible for Chase Claypool, so you have to hold him. Add Carlos Hyde. So Chris Carson left that Seahawks Sunday night game, that crazy game. He left it early with a foot injury. It's being reported right now as I'm recording this as not being significant. But regardless, you should be adding Carlos Hyde, who's his backup. After Carson's final snap of that game in the second quarter, Hyde out-attempted every Seattle running back 12-3 on the ground. He played by far the most snaps of the remaining backs. He's the go-to Chris Carson replacement, and he should see the goal line work too. Drop Cam Newton. All right, so any transaction that I talk about needs context. That's why I talk through each transaction. But I think with the quarterback position in particular, there's additional context on top of that context that's needed. And it's more so about your league. It's league context. If you're in a league where every manager is holding multiple quarterbacks, like 2 or 3 quarterbacks, you probably can't go and drop Cam Newton. So please don't hit my mentions and say, not in my league, JJ. I get it. Leagues are different. It's hard to cater content to every single league type. But if you're in a league and there's a lot of them out there where Joe Burrow was just picked up, or maybe Joe Burrow is still a free agent, then yeah, in that type of league, you can absolutely drop Cam Newton. Now, Cam does have touchdown regression heading his way on the positive end. He's only thrown 2 passing touchdowns this year. His yardage total tells us he should have closer to 6. That difference of 4 touchdowns is the largest difference in the NFL in the negative end. So Cam Newton has the most regression positively coming for him in the passing touchdown column. I just don't know if there's any hope. It's sort of like how I feel about Mike Evans. Newton's thrown for more than 200 yards in just one of his 5 games, and it came against Seattle. We know Seattle's beatable through the air. And then after running the ball 13 times per game over the first 2 games of the season, Newton's averaged just 8 across the last 3. You know, over the first 2 weeks of the season, we saw Cam Newton score 4 rushing touchdowns. That's what got us so excited. But we also knew that that wasn't sustainable. That wasn't going to happen week in and week out. So we needed his passing numbers to improve. And we hoped that if he wasn't scoring on the ground, he would score through the air. The problem is, none of that's happened. He has not gotten better as a passer. The efficiency is not there. New England has one of the worst offenses in the NFL. So the passing numbers are lacking, and he's running the ball less. That's a combination that you don't want for Cam Newton in fantasy football. And that's why right now, in some leagues, you can drop him. Add Logan Thomas. This switch to Kyle Allen has been low-key magical for Logan Thomas. His target share hasn't really changed that much with Kyle Allen under center. And we'll ignore week 5 where Kyle Allen was injured. But his efficiency has. Logan Thomas has gotten a lot more efficient with Kyle Allen under center. According to PFF, Thomas has a yards per route run rate of 1.85 across the last 2 weeks. That number was 0.7 with Dwayne Haskins under center. He has a 17.2% target share on the year. That's a number that's just been hit by 7 other tight ends. So Logan Thomas absolutely needs to be rostered. And thank God, because I touted him enough during the offseason. Sell or hold Clyde Edwards-Helaire. So we got our first glimpse on Sunday of what this new Chiefs backfield looks like with Le'Veon Bell. And on the surface, it didn't look all that bad for CEH. He ended up running the ball 8 times. He had 46 yards. He found the end zone, and he had a catch for 17 yards. It was a top 20 performance at the running back position this week. Now, after the game, I sent a tweet out noting that Edwards-Helaire's running back rush share, the percentage of team running back rushes, that it dropped pretty significantly in that game. From weeks 1 through 6, he was averaging about 81% of the team's running back rushes per game. 81% running back rush share. Against the Broncos, it was 47%. Now, the pushback from people was that the Chiefs didn't utilize their starters at the end of that game. They brought in their backups. And that's true. That's sort of true. Before the backups came in, Clyde Edwards-Helaire's running back rush share was closer to 57%, not 47%. But even still, that number is significantly lower than what we'd seen from CEH from weeks 1 through 6. Now, the good news is that CEH did see a 16.7% target share. That's a strong target share. And that's pretty much right in line with what we've seen from him as a receiver this year. But here's the problem, and Mike Clay from ESPN tweeted about this on Monday. Bell ran only 4 fewer routes than CEH in that game. Before Le'Veon Bell was a Chief, the gap between CEH and the backup running backs on that team in routes run, it was usually a little bit bigger than that. And that's kind of concerning. Now, I will say this about Clyde Edwards-Helaire. He's one of those players where it's really difficult to judge how people are valuing him. People are probably going to value him all over the place. If someone's viewing him as a lower-end RB1 or a higher-end RB2 in your league, I think you can trade him away. Because I think moving forward, he's more of a mid-range RB2 to maybe even a low-end RB2. Because keep in mind, guys, this was game 1 for Le'Veon Bell. This was the first time that he was in that Chiefs offense. What happens when he gets more acclimated? That's what scares me about CEH moving forward. Add Denzel Mims. So we finally got to see Denzel Mims on a football field, and in week 7, he had a 4-catch, 42-yard performance. But what matters most is he had a 31.8% target share. Now, some might be nervous about that usage moving forward because Jamison Crowder didn't play in week 7. But fortunately, Crowder's a slot guy, Denzel Mims is not. Crowder's played over 77% of his snaps from the slot this year, according to PFF. Mims was in the slot on 26% of his snaps. The guy who's going to be hurt most from Crowder returning is Braxton Berrios. He played 73.1% of his snaps from the slot against Buffalo on Sunday. This rookie wide receiver class is very, very good. It's living up to the hype. And maybe Denzel Mims can keep that rolling. Sell Christian Kirk. So things started a little slow this year for Christian Kirk, but they've picked up over the last couple of weeks. He has 4 touchdowns over the last 2 weeks. But he's done that on just 7 receptions. So he's a pretty obvious regression candidate. He's now scored on 27.8% of his receptions this year. His career average entering the season was a touchdown on 5.4% of his catches. He hasn't played in a single game this year with a target share above 20%. But I will say the rest of his peripherals are not that bad. Now, obviously, he's playing in a good offense. And the Cardinals' upcoming schedule isn't that bad either. This sell transaction is more so a call out. It's to say that Christian Kirk is not going to maintain what he's been doing. Add Jimmy Garoppolo. Jimmy Garoppolo gets Seattle in week 8. That's it. That's the transaction. But in all seriousness, we know that Seattle is a beatable secondary. They're the second best matchup in the league for opposing quarterbacks according to adjusted fantasy points allowed to the position. To put this another way, they've given up 4.6 more points per game than their opponents have scored this year. So Jimmy Garoppolo, his 12.5 points per game rate, which isn't that great, we should expect that to be closer to 17 in week 8. That's not bad for a quarterback streamer. Add Derek Carr. Another quarterback streamer this week is Derek Carr, who's probably been way better than you realize this year. Derek Carr on a points per game basis has been better than Drew Brees, Joe Burrow, Matt Ryan, and Ben Roethlisberger. He's averaged over 20 points per game since week 1 when they faced Carolina and Josh Jacobs got all of their touchdowns. This week, he gets the Browns, a team that's allowed 3 top 5 performances already this season to quarterbacks. In terms of adjusted fantasy points allowed, Cleveland's the 3rd best matchup for an opposing signal caller. So I like Carr as a reliable streaming option. Add the Tennessee Titans defense. So if you look at the Titans-Bengals game this weekend and you look over on FanDuel Sportsbook, the over-under is 54.5 points. But Tennessee's a 5.5 point favorite. So they should see a positive game script defensively. And that's obviously helpful for fantasy purposes. So far this year, the only team to rank worse than 15th in weekly defensive scoring against Cincinnati has been Jacksonville. And we know Jacksonville's defense sucks. The Bengals are now allowing the 4th highest sack rate in the league. With Tennessee still out there in 73% of Yahoo leagues, they make for a good streamer here in week 8. The 16th transaction this week that you can't get in my weekly 15 transactions column over on numberfire.com is to add Eno Benjamin. If Chase Edmonds is a free agent in your league, he obviously gets top priority here. But I'm assuming he's not. If he is after I said buy him a couple of weeks ago on this show, then I'm upset with you. But next on that Cardinals depth chart, now that Kenyon Drake is injured, it's Eno Benjamin. You guys might remember me talking up Benjamin in the offseason because my prospect model really liked him. He was an ultra-productive running back in college, and he's a great pass catcher. That's what I always look for. Considering the Cardinals have had some sort of split in their backfield this year with Edmonds and Drake, and considering Edmonds has 1 career NFL game with more than 8 rushes, Benjamin should be added just to see what kind of workload he gets. Edmonds could end up being a league winner, though. I am very excited about his opportunity. That's going to do it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you've yet subscribed to the Late Round Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter @LateRoundQB. Thanks, everyone. I'll talk to you tomorrow with the Weekly 10 Trend Show.